is the place where young people get together and discuss important issues that affect their lives. This is where you need to come to if you want to hear the uncensored voices of young people in Africa and abroad. I'm your host, Naledi Mulao. Hello, and welcome to Youth Expression. It's day 16 and Israel continues to pound the Gaza Strip, and there's no sign of let-up on either side. In fact, Israel and Hamas have vowed to keep fighting, ignoring international calls to stop the Gaza conflict. Hamas's leader in exile, Khalid Mishai, said his Islamic group would not consider a truce until Israel ended its military offensive and lifted the blockade on the Gaza Strip. This after Israel occupied the area on the 27th of December. Tonight we ask on Youth Expression, does the call for a boycott of Israel and its allies stem from the dislike of Jews, or do we have enough reason to cut off all ties with Israel?
Israel and Palestine are troubled neighbors, with the border towns of Sderot on the Israeli side and Gaza on the Palestinian side bearing the scars of the bitter, decades-long tensions between the Jewish state and her Arab foe. The tensions in particular are strongest between Israel and Hamas. For the past 2 weeks, the world has watched in awe as Jerusalem abandoned its moderation in dealing with the violent forces within Hamas. But Israel's supposed retaliation of Hamas' sustained terror along the borders has left behind it corpses of over 800 civilians, plus a humanitarian crisis. And Israel will not stop with its offensive just yet.
If Hamas continues its aggression, then there will be no choice. But it is not too late for the Palestinians to call on Hamas to stop its violence.
We fear, and we have reasons to do so, that Israel will delay its acceptance and the implementation of the ceasefire.
Israel has ignored this resolution for a ceasefire, sparking daily anti-Israeli protests from around the world. And although not a new demand, calls for an economic and diplomatic boycott on Israel are intensifying.
Yes, as we free here in South Africa, the Palestinians have to be free, inshallah, inshallah, inshallah.
The frustrations over the Gaza conflict are also directed towards Israel's supporters. On Thursday this week, about 300 students destroyed a KFC in Indonesia, and only because KFC is an American company. America is Israel's greatest ally. But even as we look beyond the Gaza conflict, we're asking the question, will young people in Africa afford to boycott their favorite shops and products in the name of making a political statement?
I would, I'd boycott it and wouldn't support it.
No, I wouldn't do that. Because it depends exactly when they support the war, in what way are they supporting.
Either way, it's my right to buy whatever I want to buy.
I will never support anybody, for that matter, who fight with any other human being.
Buying it means that I'm supporting the war.
The argument from the global Jewish community in regard to sanctions is that of anti-Semitism. Most say that the call for boycotts and the severing of ties with Israel is based on prejudices against Jews, and that crimes perpetrated by the Palestinians are ignored. So, to begin the debate, do we have enough reason to cut off all ties with Israel, and is the call for a boycott of Israel and its allies anti-Semitic?
Here at Youth Expression, the opinions of young people are what drives us. So later on in the show, you'll be hearing from the young people that have joined us in our studio. But before we do that, let's meet our panelists that will steer our discussion in the right direction. We are joined by Bongani Masuku of the Congress of South African Trade Union. Thank you so much for joining us, Bongani.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Muhammed Desai, leader of the Wits University Palestinian Solidarity Committee. Welcome to the show.
Thanks.
And in our Cape Town studios, or rather over the phone in Cape Town, is Professor Virginia Tilley, researcher with the Human Sciences Research Council, on the line with us from Cape Town. Hello, Professor. All right, unfortunately, we were unable to secure Jewish participation on tonight's show for reasons that I will read out in a statement. The South African Jewish Board of Deputies, on request to come to the show, sent us a statement letting us know that they would not be able to make it. The statement said, why is it only the question of whether Israel should be boycotted that is being considered? There is no attempt to call upon Palestinian leadership to account for the prolonged campaign of violence it has been waging and continues to wage against Israel and its people. I think this is a very important thing that we need to kind of bring up here. Unfortunately, we do not have Jewish representation right now with regards to the matter. But I think here's what the main question that we need to ask. Why do we need to boycott Israel? Mohammed?
During the 70s, during the 80s, Senzanina, this was asked in the townships, what have we done? The same question is asked by Palestinians. What have we done to deserve these massacres? What have we deserved to deserve this occupation? Well, the answer is simple. You were born Palestinian. In South Africa, your crime was that you were born black. However, I too asked, what is Israel going to get out of bombing the Gaza Strip? The Gaza is arguably the world's largest open-air prison, 1.5 million people. However, you see, what Israel fears is something very simple, and that is the human spirit. The human spirit that wants to live, the human spirit that will resist, the human spirit that wants to exist. It is the same human spirit that was evident in other struggles, the anti-colonial struggles, the anti-slavery struggle, the anti-apartheid struggle in our own country. Indeed, it was this human spirit to exist that was present in the Warsaw ghettos. This spirit to say that I am a human being and that I need to be respected as a human being. And it is the same spirit that is the lifeblood of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. It's a lifeblood in the sense that it's well encapsulated in the notion of Ubuntu. I am because of others. It is a spirit that says when one person of the human family has been harmed, I too have been harmed.
Okay. Yeah, I think we should hear from you then, Bongani. Tell us a little bit about, what do you think the boycotts will do? Do you think that, we will see a change if we do boycott Israel and some of its allies? And I think a very important question to ask here as well is that, the Israelis feel like they are being the victims in this situation.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think we must start with, first of all, locating it in proper context. Israel is a colonial or occupying force in Palestine. The land belongs to the Palestinians. Africans, Latin Americans, Asians, all who have gone through colonialism know the indignity or the indignation and subjection that comes, or subjugation that comes with colonialism. The fact that someone can be able to come and occupy your land and turn you into an object of his or her own interest. You cannot be a human being who rules and runs your own country and determine your own destiny. So in that context, if Israel is the occupying force, there will never be peace unless there is justice. And justice can only be the restoration of the dignity and land back to the Palestinians. Having said that, when you engage in boycott or sanctions, we as trade unions use that as a potent weapon wherever, throughout the world, for solidarity. Because every car you buy, every Motorola cell phone you use, you are contributing to the oiling of the machinery that murders and kills Palestinians. The more capacity economically Israel has, the bigger its ability to sustain a war of viciousness over Palestinians. So the same way, the fact that apartheid was assisted by the fact that people were buying the products of apartheid, but the immediate people started withdrawing or boycotting South African products at that time, that's when apartheid ran into economic crisis. It could no longer sustain the machinery of greed and murder. The same thing with Israel. So that means, despite that we know that Israel, the United States spend more than 35 billion per year, giving Israel to continue murdering and occupying and bullying the whole of the Middle East region. And we know that the occupation of Iraq and the intended occupation of Iran had to do with the fact that those two states were a threat to Israel. So it's about Israel being the bully in the whole Middle East region. So in summary, the sanctions and boycott campaign are about isolating those who cannot adhere to civilized human standards of respecting other people, first and foremost, not occupying their land, but also stopping the bombing of people in their own country, let alone the suffering of the fact that in the Gaza Strip, they have denied the people there of all their rights, electricity, water, medicine, and all other forms that any human being should have. So that is aside, but generally the occupation first and foremost.
Okay. We are still joined by Professor Virginia Tilley. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
It's a pleasure.
I think we should start off by saying, we're hearing different sides of the story. The people of Gaza are saying, why are we being hurt in such a manner? Why are we being massacred? Why are we being killed? Meanwhile, the Israeli side is saying, why are we are actually the victims. I mean, we've had rockets being thrown at us 1,000 times. Which side is more justifiable?
Well, I don't think it's a question of asking which side is more justifiable, really. I mean, I think what the other people have been saying on the show has been quite accurate and perceptive insofar as it goes. But if there's going to be real conflict resolution in this situation, and people in places like South Africa trying to decide what to do about it, there does, in addition to this analysis, need to be an appreciation of the Israeli Jewish perspective. Whether you agree with it or not, it is there, it's a perspective, and it's a set of beliefs that are very important. And in that perspective, this is not a colonial conflict. It's a self-determination project by the Jewish people who deserve a state in the world just like anybody else. Any other people has a state. And because they deserve this, and it's only fair that they should have one, the Palestinians are irrational, backward people who are unjustifiably refusing to allow them to have peace and security in the state that they have to have. Now, this narrative of Israeli nationalism, Jewish nationalism in Israel, has to be brought into the equation. And it's very important to be doing this from South Africa, because South Africa was another case like this. Afrikaner nationalism was very much the same way. Afrikaner nationalism was about a country. It still is in many ways. It's about a country in which the Afrikaner people have this is their only place. They have no place else to go. Black people have a whole continent to go to. Why can't they go off and have their dictatorships and leave Afrikaners to have a nice white democracy in the only country that they have? I'm not saying that you should agree with these ideas, but I'm saying that if you're going to address the conflict as a whole, just as Nelson Mandela started reading Afrikaner poetry and trying to understand the Afrikaner mindset, you have to understand the Jewish-Israeli mindset. Otherwise, it just bounces back and forth. Now, you don't necessarily have to understand everything in order to act. I think you can have a boycott campaign, for example, without understanding all of this. But if you want to think about why you're having a boycott campaign in Israel or any place else, you have to think about what the goals are. And in that case, you do have to pay attention to different points of view and try to put together some vision of a solution. The world is full of compromises, and this one is going to have to be a compromise also. The question is what kind. Now, there's a whole world out there of reading and ideas that have to do with stuff like this. In the ANC called it here in South Africa colonialism of a special type. When you're confronting people who have, historically you can observe they came in from another place, they came in from Europe, they settled the country, they threw the indigenous people off their land, they dispossessed them and made them hewers of wood and drawers of water. But in the Israeli case, you have to, as here, account for the fact that this population has become indigenous to the land. It has rooted itself in the land. It does see itself, this is a survival struggle. And so what's the goal? What's the goal of the boycott? This combines, reading and thinking with activism in more challenging ways. What do you want?
Professor Tilly, I think we can continue a little bit more after the break. I will have to cut you off, but we're not over yet. Now that you have met our panelists, be back right after the break when we get to hear from our audiences. Don't move. Back to Youth Expression. Before the break, you met our panelists, and now we're going to hear a little bit from the young people that have joined us here in studio. You know how we do, always having young people, making sure that they're opinionated and having a chance to say what they want to say. The main question that we are asking today, guys, is, is boycotting Israeli products the way to go? Is it justified for us to do so? I know that you'd like to say something.
Yeah, if I could just go back into history for just briefly to make this discussion relevant for South African viewers, and to just remind people the special relationship between South Africa and the State of Israel during the apartheid era. When the entire world was mobilizing to vote against apartheid in the UN, Israel alone, was one of the very few countries after 1973 that voted to either abstain or voted in support of apartheid. When the entire world was mobilizing to isolate the apartheid regime, Israel, up until the late 1980s, was sending arms and training the South African Defense Forces, which was used to kill South African freedom fighters. Israel is one of the few countries in the entire world that established relations with the Bantustans and spent millions of dollars funding them to help sustain them. And you have to ask, why is this the case? And the reason for this is Israeli leaders understood that their fate was tied to the fate of the apartheid regime. They knew that what they were doing to the indigenous population of Palestine is the exact same thing as what the South African white regime was doing to the indigenous population here. And just as boycotts, divestments, and sanctions were used as one of the many weapons to dismantle apartheid in South Africa, I think it's very important that we also use that weapon in Palestine. And one last comment is, we have to understand that BDS is a non-violent form of resistance. When Palestinians resist violently, they're accused by the supporters of Israel of being terrorists and violent people. Now that Palestinian civil society is proposing this non-violent form of resistance, we have the same criticisms from the supporters of Israel. And so this brings us to the conclusion that what really troubles supporters of Israel is not the method of Palestinian resistance, it's the fact that Palestinians have the audacity to resist at all. I think what they would like for Palestinians to do is just accept their misery and suffer in silence. But I think what the last 60 years have shown us is that Palestinians will continue to fight for freedom, just as South Africans did, until we can free our land.
Okay, but I think what we need to do as well is that, I'm a little bit upset about the fact that we don't actually have Jewish representation, to also give us that comeback when you do have something to say. But I think, what's very important about the Jewish people is that their biggest complaint is that, they have been victimized too. For the past 20 years, they've had almost 8,000 rockets being blown over into Israel. And I think it's a very important thing, but we need to think about, it's also very similar to what Professor Virginia was saying as well, is that to understand them, you also need to kind of get into their mindset. I know you'd like to say something.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that there is a confusion in terms of the ideology first, because we've got people who believe in the Zionist ideology and people who believe in terms of using power and resources that they get from the USA. And I think that the USA has been treated as the alpha and omega by all the countries, and now they are big-headed. They can use their resources to fund people, to kill other people, and all these issues. And I think that the resources that they've allocated to Israel were supposed to be spent in terms of skill development, education, and all these other issues, not instead of killing other people. And I think equally, the other issue is that USA must not be left alone If we come with the boycotts, we must equally include USA. Thanks.
Okay. All right. You'd also like to say something?
Well, we must remember that the problem isn't with Jewish people, but rather with the political ideology of Zionism. Many Jews aren't, most Jews are Zionist, but there are many Jews that aren't Zionist. There are also many Christians, the white conservative right in the US, that are staunch Zionists. So the problem shouldn't be with Jewish people. An interesting thing for Saudis not coming here today was because they felt it's anti-Semitic. For us, taking the BDS campaign up, we being accused of being anti-Semitic. We're not anti-Semitic. The problem isn't with Judaism. It's with the flawed ideology of Zionism, which is a modern political ideology which has starved 1.5 million people for the past 18 months. And that's why rockets are being fired. And in fact, on the media, we hear the term rockets. We must remember that these are projectiles. They're made in Gaza. They're made with household products. Even though I don't know what the number is, but even if 8,000 missiles or rockets or projectiles were launched into southern Israel, the rate of accuracy is less than 1%. If we look at this current attack on Gaza, up to last night, 821 Palestinians were killed, but the number of Israelis were about 11. So it shows that these missiles doesn't actually threaten anyone. That's used as a pretext. And I think the problem is that Hamas is in power, and it's something we need to look at, that Hamas has the will to go against Israel and not accept a Bantustan. And I think as the ANC didn't accept that, we should never accept a Bantustan for the Palestinians.
Okay. I like the fact that you mentioned a bit about, the Jewish people and some of the Israelis coming with the argument that, you know what, boycotting our products is anti-Semitism. Perhaps you can give us a take on that. Is it really anti-Semitic to boycott products from Israel? Bongani?
I think we must first of all separate. There are excuses that are used conveniently because the evidence in front of them is so much overwhelming. So they must find all sorts of shallow excuses. Fascism, racism, apartheid are all ideologies of superiority based on the assumption that a particular race are the preserves of a particular privilege or particular privileges. The rest are subhuman. So therefore, anti-Semitism is an attempt or a justification by Israel to attempt to confuse the debate into some religious corner. The issue here is, who would hate Israel if it were to stop occupying Palestine and bombing Gaza? Certainly the apartheid regime, you remember in South Africa, that it used that same regime, all sorts of shallow excuses against itself. But now that South Africa is a democratic society, who is concerned or attacking whites in South Africa? Certainly no one. So the point of the matter is that if Israel were to stop oppressing or persecuting the Palestinians, then certainly anyone who will continue to persecute them would necessarily be Semitist. But for now, it can't be anti-Semitism. It's about the acts that they carry out against other people. In fact, if it were to be used correctly, the inverse may be true. The truth of the matter is that they are practicing Semitism against Palestinian people. So they want us to accept that they must continue to be a privileged group that has exclusive right and monopoly over violence and the right to unleash as much subjugation to other people as possible.
Sure. Okay, I think what we have done is that a lot of the time today we've actually we've done quite a few comparisons between, what's happening in Gaza and right here in South Africa with regards to apartheid and so forth. But now I think what's a very important question to ask, which was also raised by, the Jewish side of the argument before they actually declined and said they wouldn't be able to make it, was that, their biggest worry with coming on the show was that now we're going to create a divide between the Jewish people here in South Africa and the Muslim people here in South Africa. Are we seeing a gap right here in South Africa as well, and in other countries outside of just the Middle East?
Ridiculous. This is an argument that's brought up over and over again. In fact, I think that the protests that we have witnessed in South Africa have seen a strengthening of links between Jewish people and Muslim people, and in fact, all those that have come out on the streets to say no to this carnage that is happening. To go back to something that one of the audience members raised, yes, in many ways, our links to Israel is a hangover from the apartheid days. But guys, we're not doing this here out of the boycotting or divesting from Israel is not done out of sympathy or just mere outrage. We are guilty. We are complicit in every bullet that is shot in Gaza. Our trade with Israel has increased by 14% with regard to imports and 24% with regard to exports. Our exploited labor, the profits from our exploited labor here in South Africa, these profits get sent over to Israel to fund some more bullets, to fund some more of this carnage. And so it's not merely out of sympathy that we have to act, but we have to say no, that this is not going to be done in our name. We are doing this here so that we can walk on the streets of the international community without any shame, without taking part in this carnage. But one more point on this Jewish reaction. These people are absurd. The day after the attacks, the day after 200 Palestinians were killed in a mere 15 minutes, the South African Jewish Board of Deputies comes out with a statement that unapologetically supports the attacks on Gaza. What kind of people are these? People that come out to support the state of Israel. And as soon as protests start taking place in South Africa, they don't want anything to do with it. I don't know whether there is any need for dialogue with people who don't want to recognize suffering, people who don't want to recognize violence.
Okay, I'd like to hear a little bit more from the people in our audiences. I know that we haven't given them enough time. There's a gentleman over here that would like to say something.
I think the claims that we are possibly creating a divide within our own nation, which has focused very hard on nation building in the last 15 years or so, I think that making those claims is trying to push for that eventuality to occur. No one has called for a boycott against Jewish companies. If that was the case, we would be going around within our own borders and trying to identify who or might not, which businesses are. But that hasn't been done. No one has and no one is calling for a boycott of Jewish business. That would support the claim of being anti-Semitic. The calls are only for a boycott against companies, whether they are Jewish or not, that support the Israeli regime.
Okay, thank you so much for saying that. You can pass it over there to the gentleman at the back, actually.
I just wanted to say something just short. The two major religious factions here really are the Jewish and the Muslim people. Essentially, I actually think that the key here is sharing. If you think about it, both the religions teach, God states and teaches that the religions should say that they should share. Why is it that the Muslims and the Jews keep fighting around? Why can't they just share? If there's a piece of land there, both of them use it. I mean, just a very simplistic thing. But I mean, both the religions, they are being, hypocritical about the religions. Both religions teach them this and they go against it. I mean, I really think that the key here is going to be sharing between them. I mean, honestly, the boycott would be a brilliant idea because it can stop this entirely. It will really stop the funding into Israel to cause this carnage that's going on. I mean, really, I think that really is the key, and the boycott is a very good idea.
Okay. Well, we've heard from our young people in our audiences. We've heard from our panel. Thank you so much for joining us. We'd also like to say thank you to Professor Virginia Tilly that was in Cape Town with us. It was lovely speaking to you. We do know that there is a prayer session held by the Jewish people of South Africa today, praying for solidarity and peace in the Gaza area. Sadly, we have reached the end of the show. It's very important that young people speak out and stand up against violence. Have your say, and let's all encourage each other to not just sit back and do more when we see injustices such as these taking place. Make sure that you catch next week's show when we have young people here in studio with us talking through more important issues. That's Saturday, 6:30 Central African Time, only on SABC News International. This is Naledi Moleo saying never stop expressing yourself.
Now, Israel and Hamas have vowed to keep fighting despite international calls to stop the Gazan conflict. The fighting entered a 16th day today with heavy clashes between Israeli troops and Palestinian fighters. Hamas leader in exile, Khaled Mishal, said his Islamist group would not consider a truce until Israel ended its military offensive and lifted a blockade of the Gaza Strip.
31 more people died in fresh Israeli airstrikes in the Gaza Strip. Emergency services say 50 more were wounded in airstrikes and tank shelling on houses in the enclave. The death toll since the beginning of Israel's offensive in the Gaza Strip, which began on December 27th, has now surpassed 820 killed and more than 3,000 wounded. New York-based Human Rights Watch has accused Israel of using white phosphorus munitions and warned of undue suffering to Palestinian civilians through severe burns. Israel says it uses only weapons permitted by international law. It has accused Hamas of using civilians as human shields. Israel has pressed on with its offensive despite a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire and Egyptian-European efforts at mediation, saying it's intent on stopping Hamas rocket fire. In Egypt, efforts by President Hosni Mubarak to broker a ceasefire showed little sign of progress. Hamas's leader in exile, said that his group would not consider a truce until Israel ended its military offensive and lifted a blockade of the Gaza Strip.
Now we are living in the hardest days, so we want stronger resistance in Gaza, and we want a third uprising in the West Bank and the Arab and Islamic streets until the aggression ends and the enemy withdraws from Gaza and the crossings are opened.
ويرفع الحصار وتفتح المعابر على أرضنا المباركة في غزة.
The fighting continued even during a 3-hour ceasefire window Israel has observed in recent days to allow humanitarian aid to help sustain the territory's 1.5 million residents. Meanwhile, Israeli aircraft dropped leaflets telling South Gaza residents that it was about to step up its offensive.
On the diplomatic front, Egypt has ruled out allowing international troops on its border with Gaza as part of a possible ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas.
More Hamas rockets bring injury and damage to the Israeli city of Ashkelon. 2 Israelis are wounded. Israel's 2-week bombardment of Gaza has clearly failed to destroy their military capability. And how Hamas gets hold of its weapons is a key issue for Israel. Some diplomats believe deploying foreign troops along the 15-kilometre border with Egypt might prevent some smuggling. Egypt and Germany's foreign ministers have been discussing the option, but only a compromise deal could be reached.
This morning, we agreed that in the next few days, a group of experts from Germany will travel here to discuss with Egyptian experts what we can do to help equip or train the Egyptian border police, or even help them develop border control strategies.
Hamas has just released a new video of what it says are attacks on Israeli soldiers inside Gaza, more proof perhaps of their military capability. Egypt says most Hamas weaponry comes by sea, and war will never stop the rocket attacks.
They will not achieve the destruction of Hamas. No one can destroy a resistance movement. No one, whether in Gaza or outside of Gaza. And that's what we are telling them, go for a political settlement.
Whether the German deal will persuade Israel to end or at least pause its current offensive isn't clear. And for now, the bombing goes on. 8 members of one Palestinian family died in one of the latest Israeli airstrikes on the Jabalia refugee camp. The total number of Palestinians killed in the fighting now stands at least 821. 13 Israelis have also died.
Across the globe, protests for and against the Israeli offensive in Gaza rage on. In Paris, France, protesters clashed with police at the end of a pro-Palestinian demonstration. Dozens of youths threw projectiles at riot police, vandalized bus stops and burned parked motorcycles. And in the USA, protesters faced off with pro-Israeli demonstrators in Washington, D.C.
Senior protesters taking part in the protest tried to stop the younger generation from using violence, which regularly happens at the end of Paris demonstrations, where youngsters scuffle with police for no real reason. Organizers of the march said that over 100,000 people took part in the Paris demonstration and 3,800 police were mobilized. In Washington, D.C., pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel demonstrators faced off against Israel's offensive in Gaza. Protesters brandishing banners and Palestinian flags, chanting Free Palestine, approached a small group of pro-Israel demonstrators. A minor confrontation ensued, but it was quickly broken up by police. Tens of thousands of demonstrators also marched in cities across Europe and the Middle East on Saturday to protest against Israel's offensive in Gaza.